So this is our Simondon reading group, continuing our reading of Imagination and Invention. We're in part 1, section A, and we're at the beginning of subsection 4 on page 49 of the PDF, of the English translation. I think it's the same pagination in the PDF and the printed book. So what we looked at last time was so we started on part B of section B of part 1. So this is the images in states of expectation and anticipation. So we're going through his cycle of the image that he's set out in the introduction. So the image goes through this cycle where we start with anticipation, which happens before the encounter with the object, and then we have the actual encounter with the object itself, and then we have the sort of persistence of the image after the encounter of the object with the object. And then this 3-part cycle repeats at 3 levels. So there's the level of what he called the biological level, or sometimes the primary level. So in this level, it's the entire organism that responds to the image, either by attacking or running away, or some other sort of whole organism response to this image. And then the second level is what he calls the psychical level, though he says that this is not entirely satisfactory. But this second level is one where it's no longer the whole organism that responds, but there's some sort of differentiated response of the organism, so that, for example, in anticipation, the organism now has some sort of image of possible alternative actions, for example, or possible alternative states of affairs. And the organism can, in certain cases, can weigh these different alternatives against each other and, choose a course of action based on some sort of decision. And then the third level, which we may get to today, I'm not sure how far we'll go, but the third level is the level of reflexive thought. So this is where we sort of explicitly take our thinking as the object of our thought, and so he primarily has in mind here philosophy as a kind of reflexive thought, but other sort of modes of making our thought into an object also appear. So we can think of religious ideas along these lines, and I think potentially artistic creation as well. I'm not sure if Simondon explicitly addresses that in this set of lectures. So we looked at the first two. So he goes through the cycle sort of transversally. So he goes through the anticipation phase at each of the levels, and then the next section that we'll get to probably next time, he goes through the present, the encounter phase at each level, and then he'll go through the recollection phase at each level. So we saw the second level, the first phase at the second level. So we're talking about psychological anticipation in the first couple sections that we read last time. So one instance of this is phobias that he talks about in relation to sort of folklore and legends in Europe. And so he talks about this sort of folklore or legendary image of the toad as this sort of dangerous, poisonous creature that spits venom and so on. And so he points out that this is not sort of based on any real perception of a toad. So it's not like you encounter a toad, observe that it spits venom, and then form this concept of the toad, because toads in reality don't spit venom. They do have toxins in their skin, but they are not sort of dangerous creatures that you should be afraid of. So you have this sort of phobic image of the toad where you have these fears that are sort of projected outwards onto this other entity, and he makes this interesting argument about the whole sort of set of images related to ogres and other creatures that eat human beings, and he argues that this is a sort of outward projection of the desire that people might experience in, for example, when they're in a famine or in a city under siege, they might experience the desire to actually eat their neighbors to alleviate their hunger, but then they sort of reject that desire outwards. They project it onto someone else and say this is like a sort of monstrous desire that someone else would have, some other creature would have, not something that I would actually, desire for my own part. Uh, and he sort of alludes. He just makes a sort of quick mention, but like he talks about how in our contemporary societies we have other types of sort of phobic responses that so at the individual level there are people that are claustrophobic or agoraphobic or have various other phobias. So they there are certain situations that they avoid because they have this overpowering fear of these kinds of situations, and often the sort of thought process that accompanies these fears is a kind of anticipation of something horrible that would happen. So, like in the claustrophobia example that Simondon talks about here, he says about this fear of asphyxiation. So if you're trapped in a subway tunnel, for example, you start to fear that you're going to run out of air, even though, of course, the amount of air compared to the number of people, it means that would like take probably a very long time to happen, and so there's no real danger of that happening. But it's this sort of anticipation of a future horrible event that you sort of that overpowers you and prevents you from performing certain actions or entering into certain situations and so on. And then he looked at Lucretius's specific argument about certain kinds of fear or certain developments that occur in relation to fear, and it's this of doubling of the self in the fear of death. So Lucretius argues that our fear of death has to do with this sort of imaginary experience where we think of ourselves as both the corpse and also like sort of standing next to our corpse and mourning ourselves. So we sort of split ourselves into two in our fear of death, and we imagine that we'll be sort of standing there and thinking all the things that that I could have done, all the experiences that I never had, and so on. You sort of mourn yourself, whereas as a good materialist, Lucretius holds that death is just the end of experience. There's no sort of continuation of the self after death. The soul, which is made up of various light atoms inside the body, just sort of dissipates after death, and so there's no more experience after death than there is experience before birth. And so, yeah, this sort of splitting of the self or doubling of the self is the sort of imaginary accompaniment or imaginary anticipation of death. And likewise, there's also a sort of doubling of our fear or an externalization of our fear into our images of the gods or of supernatural powers that sort of bring about these phenomena that we fear. So he talks about the thunderstorm. Whereas animals might sort of run away from a thunderstorm or try to run away, human beings recognize that running away is futile, but they sort of project the fear that and the helplessness that they feel in the face of the thunderstorm onto some supernatural entity that they can supplicate. They can perform sacrifices or make prayers or do something to try to alleviate the thunderstorm or prevent themselves from being hurt by it. And then this image of this entity that brings about the thunderstorm, this sort of projection of our fear onto something outside ourselves, this image then then persists after the thunderstorm and forms our sort of image of the god who brings about thunderstorms. So then we have this obligation to worship this entity, to perform sacrifices and so on, to prevent future thunderstorms. And then the next section or subsection was about the alternative. So we looked at the sort of negative states of anticipation of fear in particular, but then there's the other side of anticipation, which is positive states of anticipation. hope and similar phenomena. And so Simondon points out that Lucretius's analysis of religion maybe applies to certain gods, especially the sort of public worship of the city-states of the Mediterranean and the ancient world. So you have these gods that you have to, sacrifice to and perform these sort of public rituals. But then there was also this other sort of strand of religion in the ancient world, which is the mystery cults or the initiatory cults. So Orphism, for example. So you have these religions or these religious practices where people have these kind of they were sort of open secrets because everyone was a member of these religions, but you weren't supposed to talk about the rituals publicly or sort of describe the religious ideas publicly. But they, in general, have to do with resurrection or immortality. And so this is what Simondon talks about in relation to hope. So we hope to be reunited with our loved ones who have died. We have this anticipation of a future state in which we will be reunited with them, and this sort of hope is again projected outwards into a sort of external reality in which that hope is realized. And so this is another set of religious ideas that doesn't really fall under the sort of genealogy of religion that Lucretius emphasizes. And so again, we have this anticipation of resurrection, and so Simondon talks about this cemetery that has an image of a rooster on top of the lanterns in the cemetery, and this rooster symbolizes, so in the same way that in real life a rooster crows at dawn and wakes everyone up, this sort of symbolic rooster will crow and wake up the dead, and they will return to life. And so this is a sort of image that has to do with anticipation of in a positive sense. So hope for the return of the dead, for example. And then the next bit that we'll see today, this is a longer subsection, but there are these sort of mixed states. So not purely fear or purely hope, but some sort of mix of the two. So let's go on to that part if someone else would like to volunteer to read the first page or so.
I can read. We're on page 49, is that right?
Yes, exactly.
So, anticipation images in mixed states, the marvelous as category of mixed anticipation. Amplificatory projection always appears in the work of the anticipatory image, either through the centrifugal gesture of pushing away to ward off, in transcendentalizing fear, or in the immediate quest of initiatory communion, characterizing the anticipation of renewal and hope. Doubling followed by alienation is the opposite of the initiatory introduction. But such pure cases, visible particularly in religious images, are rare. The mixed case, states of expectation where fear and hope intermix in variable proportions, is much more frequent. Love, Plato says, is the son of Poros and Penia, abundance and privation. And by the same token, he is the son of mixed fears and hopes. In this case, the amplificatory projection continues to exist, but it has neither the exclusive sense of movement towards the outside, positing the transcendence of the doubled image as an idol, nor that of inner participation according to the world of birth in the immediate hic et nunc. In the encounter of these two movements, the tending towards transcendence and the other towards immanence, there occurs a kind of stilling of images projected midway between the movement of true transcendence and the immanence in relation to the subject. An imaginary world of anticipatory images is thereby created, floating between extreme distance and immediate proximity, still, like a rainbow which always remains between ourselves and the horizon. We are dealing with a third reality, to invoke the expression Edgar Morin used to characterize certain cultural phenomena and the transmission of information. One example of such third reality is the marvelous, surrounding princes, artists, and actresses. These figures do not occupy the highest ranks, but they surround those that do, and commerce with them. They are the court rather than the sovereign. The court is akin to the city. It is close to the everyday, like a mediation stopping midway. In the warp and woof of the contemporary marvelous, princesses become superior to queens because they are less firmly installed, less distant, and more virtual, since they can become queen. Participation in this marvelous is made possible by the media, especially weeklies with the largest photos, but also radio and television. Such media represent precisely an intermediary screen floating between background reality and the reality of the subject. The time for accessing these screens is leisure time, which belongs to an intermediary category between the insertion in the present of situations and absent travel. Let us note that participation in this intermediary world is made possible by the fact that these marvelous figures are described, photographed, and filmed in the reality common circumstances. I'll just start the sentence again. Let us note that participation in this intermediary world is made possible by the fact that these marvelous figures are described, photographed, and filmed in the relatively common circumstances of their life, comparable to the common everyday existence we lead. This creates the effect of a subjective rapprochement. On the other hand, these figures bear signs of belonging to a far away, superior, and inaccessible world due to differences of birth, etiquette, extreme wealth, or even spatial distance. Participation in the historical marvelous as an intermediary world arises in the same way through the description of the everyday aspects of the most prestigious historical figures, the lives of kings, and the chronicles of lowercase history. The outpouring of desires into the intermediary world of the marvelous is correlated to an impoverished horizon of the real. The recourse to the marvelous born from limits experienced in everyday life results in depriving real life, integrated to the social body, of a part of its motivation. The recourse to the marvelous translates the existence of powerful limits and the monotony of situations or tasks, like those of a housewife or a typist harboring no great hopes to see their condition experienced as limited and determined, ever change. The novel was long the support for the activity of the imagination as a power of escape. It operates an imaginary deployment of personal power through the participation in the acts of the protagonist. Serialized, the novel directly feeds states of expectation and anticipation through the suspense it creates between installments. This temporal modality, which is essential here, translates into a loss of interest caused by the premature revelation of the end. The preservation of the state of expectation after the end of the novel may lead to multiple sequels, unlimited continuations of episodes, as we see in 19th century novels. Each type of expectation state evinces a corresponding kind of marvelous. Cinderella dreams of the prince, while warriors amidst insecurity and danger and the confusion of threats of battles think about the great, manifest, and illustrious deeds in which one can count on the clarity of a just cause and on supernatural aid. The qualities of the marvelous are the antitypes of those of lived reality.
Right. Yeah, we can stop here. Thanks. Yeah. So this is these mixed states of neither pure fear nor pure hope. So we have these anticipations in our everyday lives, or in some sort of connection with our everyday lives, where we both have some fear and have some hope, and have this. So Simondon argues that these types of images form a sort of intermediate reality that's sort of in the world, but not quite in the world. So it's neither sort of posited outside the world, like the images of fear, these gods that send us thunderstorms and other punishments, but it's not something sort of imminent to our world, like the hope that we have that the dead will be returned to us. It's this sort of mixed or intermediate state, and he talks about in our contemporary societies these sort of celebrity figures, and not just like he mentions actresses, but I think the example that he talks about princesses is maybe a more uh, appropriate example here, because these are people that are depicted as being sort of outside of the realm of the normal of the everyday, and they have something sort of magical about them, or something extraordinary about them, and so I think his comment about how the princess is more sort of has more value in this sense than the queen, I think is a pretty apt remark, and it made me think of the whole sort of I don't know what to call it exactly, but the relation to Princess Diana, as people talked about her as the people's princess, and there was this sort of popularity of her, and there's of course her tragic death and everything. There's a whole kind of romance around her, um, and as opposed to Queen Elizabeth was sort of a remote figure, and there was never any sort of there was never a similar sort of popular sort of romance around her life. And I think this holds in general for the royals. There's like this idea of them as they're sort of celebrities, but they're more than like regular celebrities. They have this sort of semi mystical power about them, or something like that. And In particular, the king and queen, or whoever is the reigning monarch, tends to be sort of remote, but it's the prince and princess figures that seem to have the most sort of draw or attractive power in the sort of public imagination. And so, yeah, it's this sort of state of virtuality that, as Simondon puts it, that they have the potential to become the king or the queen, or something like that, but they are not yet. So they have this sort of anticipatory quality built into the position that they occupy. And Yeah, and yeah, the royal sort of the media obsession around the royals is not something that I am particularly interested in either. Yeah, so this is an interesting sort of diagnosis of what's going on in that sort of world. Something that I think I find sort of alien to me. But the other aspect of this is that these sort of figures of the royals, or these sort of celebrity figures, provide us with, or provide the people who engage in this sort of imaginary relation to them. They provide a kind of escape from a reality that is experienced as limiting, or sort of too confined. So he talks about here the sort of figures of the housewife and the typist, and again, so this is like 1950s, 1960s sort of social reality, where these were sort of conceived as positions that would be limiting. So many women who were in these positions would have experienced these social roles as being limiting and not offering opportunities for advancement, for sort of exercise of their capacities, and so on. But then sort of living vicariously through these celebrity figures allows you to escape this limiting reality. And then Simoneau talks about the novel as another kind of means of escape from reality. Yeah, so this was especially in the 19th century. Sort of the role of the novel in popular life. There were all these. Charles Dickens, for example, had very popular serial novels so they were published in installments in newspapers or magazines or whatever. And yeah, so these novels were very popular, and they were a means of escape. So people would sort of imagine themselves into the situations of the novel. And today it probably is more the case that TV shows maybe provide these types of escapes from reality. So people and you have TV series that sometimes last, well, not so much anymore, but sometimes last for many years with new situations arising, and you can always sort of extend the situation into a new set of events, a new story, and you can imagine yourself into the role of the protagonist, and you can think of yourself as heroic or whatever other sort of qualities you wish you had. So yeah, this is this sort of intermediate reality of something that is within the world, but sort of outside of the ordinary or everyday life.
I thought the part about the limiting social roles was interesting in relation to the section on Lucretius. It seems like the discussion of the thunderstorm that gives rise to the need for a very powerful supernatural being to which you can make supplication in an extremely dangerous situation produces this extremely transcendent image. But these other unpleasant situations, which are less dangerous than great natural disasters, also create the kind of expectation that amplifies an image, just one that is not, it's like there's less force behind it because it's a fear of monotony or dissatisfaction with your life, so it produces this image kind of in the middle distance.
Yeah, and I think so. It's less powerful in the sense that it doesn't have this sort of life and death significance. But then there's also this mixture of the fear of being sort of stuck in a dead end job, or living in this situation where you feel that your capacities are not being exercised. There's sort of this fear on the one hand, but then also this hope of what if one day I married a prince, or I became a famous actor, or an artist, or whatever other sort of celebrity figure. You have this sort of imaginary anticipation of a future state where you sort of escape from the realm of the ordinary and enter into this marvelous world. So there's this mixture of fear of being stuck in a situation that you feel is sort of constraining, and then anticipation of an imaginary future where you escape that world. And so it's this mixture of both fear and anticipation and hope that makes it have this sort of semi-transcendent, semi-immanent quality that's sort of in the world but not quite everyday life sort of position.
Yeah, maybe this is like kind of quibbling with Simondon, but I think that in the thunderstorm scenario, isn't obviously there's a powerful affective fear, but isn't there also the whole point of inventing a god that you can make prayers to save you from the storm seems to be a kind of hopeful gesture as well. So maybe it's not, there's a mixture of fear and hope in that scenario as well.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I think he points to these two sort of extreme cases of pure fear and pure hope. But I think we can probably say that maybe the pure extremes would never fully be realized. There would never be a situation of pure fear with no mixture of hope, or pure hope with no mixture of fear. And so we always have to do with these intermediate images that have a mixture of both. But the question is what is the balance of the two, or the preponderance of one over the other in any given image? And so we have some images where there's a much greater sort of element of fear, and those are the images of the gods who demand a sacrifice. And then we have these other images where we have a much greater elements of hope, like our hope to be reunited with our loved ones. And then we have this sort of intermediate ones where they are sort of approximately even. The hope and fear are approximately even, and these are the sort of images of the marvelous within the world, or of these entities that are part of the world but outside of everyday life. Okay, so let's go on to the next page or so. So we're at page 51 in other instances. If someone else would like to read from there.
I can read. In other instances, this complementary aspect of the imaginary with respect to the real resides in the object, rather than being figured in the unfolding of a hero's action, which permits the participation of the subject. Freighted with expectation, the bearer of the outcomes of desire, the object is endowed with a metamorphic power, as in the Golden Age or in tales and myths. Often, the animal is in fact a disgraced human who must be redeemed and saved with love and courage, even through a real sacrifice. The key for the future lies in the intensity of the present state of desire, bearing on an object of ignoble but transfigurable appearance. The toad can become a prince again, but only for her who has the courage to allow him in her bed. The bluebird, too, is a prince chained by a spell to his animal state. Other times, the object has not undergone metamorphosis, but is in a state close to death, and only the intensity of desire can bring it back to life. Sleeping Beauty, wounded by the shuttle, kept her golden colors, but lay in a castle surrounded with thorns and brush, said to be haunted by an ogre. Only the ardor of a prince, quote unquote, afire, is needed for all the trees, thorn, and brush to retreat on their own, closing back as soon as the prince has passed. The extreme desire is projected in the object, which it seeks and transfigures. The prince, too, was waiting. Quote, "Is it you, my prince?" Unquote, she says to him. Quote, for so long I have been awaiting you," unquote. There is an important difference between the object susceptible to metamorphosis as base of expectation laden with desire and fear, and the symbol object, which does not undergo metamorphosis but remains the analogon of another reality. Cinderella's lost Sibylline slipper is an analogon, a symbol that allows the young woman to be found again. In another tale by Perrault, The Skilled Princess, the glass distaff of Finette, Nonchalante, and Babillard are analogon of their virginity, only Finette keeping her distaff intact. The gold ring of donkey skin, which the prince finds in the cake, plays the role of an analogon, allowing him to find the true princess under the tramp everyone despises. In this last tale, the symbol ring functions as a trigger of the metamorphosis of the tramp into a princess, at the same time that it exacerbates desire through waiting. The ring was tried out by all the women of the country, from the higher to the lower classes, from city to countryside, when at last the turkey keeper is brought in. The symbolic link that exists between objects, according to the categories of anticipation, is not the expression of perceptual communication between two realities. The slipper or the ring are not perceptually linked to the woman desired. They are modes of becoming that found the analogy, because the symbol object elicits, in miniature, the same desires and fears that symbolized it. The gold and diamond ring is precious, it can be lost, it is hidden in flour and is discovered suddenly, like donkey skin, who, hidden under her rags and the soot covering her cheeks, reveals the splendor of her white dress as the donkey skin falls off when she tries on the ring. The glass distaff is a symbol of virginity because it breaks all at once, irreversibly. There are also perceptual symbols that psychoanalysis has studied, but those of the marvelous exist in the dimension of the modes of anticipatory becoming. They are anti-perceptual, implying the categories of action rather than perception. So, I guess I'm trying to understand how these are intermediate symbols, but it seems like in the example of the metamorphoses, they're intermediate because the object undergoes a change from disappointing reality to hoped for future. And the sort of transitional objects in the second paragraph, even if they don't themselves change, they symbolize something that is going to bring about a change to some hoped for outcome, I think.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think, so one question is like, how do these sort of, how do the images in these legends or fairy tales, how do they differ from the images that were discussed in the previous sections, the fearful images of the gods and the hoped for images of the resurrection of the dead? So this sort of ambiguity or this transformation is part of it. I think that the toad is sort of has the capacity to turn back into a prince. And so this hated or despised animal is sort of a hidden manifestation of some sort of marvelous reality, and these sort of transformations of like the Cinderella story, for example, sort of fall under the same category as the typist who imagines that one day she'll become a famous actress or marry a prince or whatever. So it's the same type of story where the sort of servant girl has this imaginary transformation into a princess, and so I think it's this capacity to undergo this transformation from this despised reality to this marvelous reality that underlies these kinds of images or this category of images. And then there's this analogon factor that Simondo also brings up, and I think we can connect this with his idea of the symbol. So this is something that came up a lot in volume 1 of the individuation book. He constantly uses this term symbol in this sort of unique sense derived from the ancient Greek practice of taking a token of some kind, a stone or a piece of clay or whatever, and breaking it in half, and then each party of some sort of social relationship would keep half of this broken token, and then they would unite the two halves as a sign of sort of recognition of one party by the other. And sometimes these were passed down in families so that your descendants would be able to recognize the descendants of the other party. And so for Simondon, a symbol is always a sort of half of a reality, is always a portion that has a complementary reality outside of itself. And so here we have like the symbol. I think the sort of Disney version of Cinderella kind of mixes a couple of different fairy tales, but you have this glass slipper, for example, in the Disney version, where this is this sort of very delicate, elegant slipper that sort of corresponds to the princess, this sort of hidden princess, and the sort of despised reality of Cinderella as the servant girl ends up being transformed in connection with this slipper. And so the slipper, this glass slipper, is a kind of symbol of the reality of the princess. So it's this element that fits with the reality of the princess. And so a lot of these stories involve some sort of, you have the slipper, the ring, some of these different stories anyway, there's these sort of objects that symbolize, in both our sort of normal sense of the word symbol, but also in Simondon's sense, they have this connection to this other reality that they sort of fit into, in sometimes a very literal spatial sense. They sort of connect with this other reality that they point towards. And I think the other bit to mention here is what Simondon points out, is that these symbols are not connected to the reality that they point towards in a perceptual sense. So the ring, for example, is found in the cake or bread or whatever, and it sort of points towards this reality of the princess who will wear the ring. But the prince hasn't yet seen the princess, so this is a kind of anticipatory image as opposed to a perceptual image. And then likewise with the slipper, the prince doesn't know who it belongs to, and sort of has this anticipation of the princess that the slipper will fit. Okay, so let's go on to the next page. If I can get another volunteer to read.
From Access.
Yes.
Access to the marvelous may sometimes be tinted by the supernatural when the metamorphosis of objects requires the intervention of a supernatural power. In such a case, a conversion is the object becoming a reality out of a figuration, or a living being from a corpse. Such a change of nature prolongs and amplifies the movement of human feelings that then manifest as a call to supernatural power that might effectuate what human beings can only wish and wait for. It is a miracle that comes after an intense longing. This transpires in the legend of the child a woman offered to the Virgin Mary out of love of the one she had lost. Pardon me. Here, the strongest of human feelings, maternal love, crosses the boundary of the sacred to call for a miracle. We might also allude to The Tidings Brought to Mary by Paul Claudel, where the child of Mara, dead and cold, comes back to life through a metamorphosis when Violaine breastfeeds him. This is indeed a multiple miracle, since it is also the metamorphosis of the young woman, leprous, alone, and abandoned, into a mother breastfeeding her child, and into the spiritual wife of Pierre de Cran, whom she faithfully loved. In a simpler yet more general way, legends imply the presence of the supernatural in metamorphosis we might call amplificatory. Where there was nothing, something becomes manifest. A ground that has turned arid becomes fertile once again, or a corpse is replaced by a living being resuscitated. Hence the knight with the small cask, unable to bring a single drop of water from a well in his cask, feels his heart break, and cries at the remembrance of his past faults. A tear falls on the cask's hole, and instantly it multiplies and stirs, the cask overflowing into a lively stream. After Penia comes Poros, out of the very excess of Penia. The same goes for the hagiographic legends, in which pilgrim staffs, hard and knotty, sprout roots, leaves, and flowers to revert to living trees. In metamorphosis, the presence of the supernatural allows the irreversible to be unbound from its irreversibility, and what is lifeless to find life again. The saint is the one who inverts the course of the irreversible. Thanks to her, the irredeemable no longer exists. One evening, upon entering into the shop of a butcher who killed 3 small children, St. Nicholas places his hand on the salting barrel where they lie, and the children come back to life. Thanks to the supernatural, remorse and regret may be transmuted into repentance, because there is a renewal of the sense of openness and the dimension of the future, according to which no specific action can create the irremissible nevermore. In this sense, the coherent image of the possible, as an anticipation framed by the future and fear, intervenes in what was called in philosophy the moral life. And we might wonder whether it does not play as essential a role as that granted to obligation. Bergson deeply felt this necessity of openness for moral life, and he linked it to the intuition of movement, while obligation precedes vis tergo, to a force that was determining and necessitating in the order of causes exerted upon the subject by social life.
Right. So here we have more sort of discussion of the transitional nature or transformatory nature of this intermediate object. So it's and he talks about these legends of saints as a kind of example of this, where what the transformation of the object does, or the role that this image of an object that undergoes transformation is to reverse the irreversible, essentially. So death, as one of the prime examples, you can bring the dead back to life. But this is a different kind of resurrection than the type of resurrection that Simondon talks about in relation to the hope for being reunited with our loved ones. So here, it's resurrection. Generally, these resurrections happen sort of immediately after the death of. So in this one legend with Saint Nicholas, we have the children who have been killed, and the saint brings them back to life. So it's not so much. And I don't know this legend in particular, but often it's not the case that those people in particular are sort of missed, or that someone has this intense emotion that they want to be reunited with these people, but it's the act itself of sort of reversing the course of time and bringing these people back to life that manifests the power of the saint, or of the transitional image. So it's it's not so much that these children are missed and sort of the desire to be reunited with them that plays a role in the story. It's the fact that the saint has the capacity to reverse this irreversible deed of killing the children. It's this that is sort of emphasized in the image of the saint as the one who can bring about a transformation that undoes these irremediable actions. And then there's this bit that I think is, he doesn't go into it in much detail, but is a pretty interesting remark about the role of this type of openness of the future in relation to moral life. So he makes reference to Bergson here, and of course, Bergson, his whole sort of philosophical enterprise is about the experience of duration and the openness of the future, and what Simondon sees as being relevant about this is that our moral life, our sort of capacity to recognize ourselves as moral beings, has to do not just with obligations, but also with this capacity for bringing about a transformation in the way that the world is. We can think about it, I guess, if the world were organized in such a way that everything always happened in accordance with moral obligations, then those moral obligations would not really be moral obligations. They would just be sort of laws of nature. So it's only insofar as there is a sort of openness to the future that we can sort of recognize certain obligations as being moral ones. And so the obligation has this sort of constraining aspect to it. It sort of forces or it brings about the conformity with a certain moral obligation, but then it has to be sort of counterbalanced by this openness of the future as well. So it's only in a situation where there is an actual openness of the future and the potential for transformations to occur that we sort of conceive of something as being a moral obligation. And I think we can think about this in connection also with Simondon points to repentance as being sort of the maybe less miraculous sort of manifestation of this transformation. So someone who does something that contravenes a moral obligation or harms someone else or whatever the action might be, they might be, we can think of them as sort of hardened and not caring about other people and so on. But there's always this possibility that the person will undergo a transformation and repent of their past actions and change their life in the future. This possibility always remains open. So this openness to transformation is an element of moral life, and is sort of what's depicted in this miraculous form in these images of the saint who brings the child back to life, or all these other sort of transformations.
One section in these paragraphs that Ben just read that is a bit mysterious to me is the end of that first paragraph, where he distinguishes these symbols from perceptual symbols. So they're anti-perceptual. I don't really understand the distinction he's trying to make there. Is it because they are related to, they're created by some feeling of anticipation? Or, obviously a ring is something that you perceive, although I don't know if the point is that the ring was hidden and had to be uncovered.
Yeah, I think the idea here of these being anti-perceptual symbols, so anti with an E as in prior, for those listening. So these symbols are anti-perceptual because they have to do with an anticipated reality. So the ring belongs to this anticipated princess that the prince has to search the whole kingdom for. And it's this sort of anticipated reality of the princess that the anticipation sort of amplifies the value of this reality. The princess must be sort of the most beautiful, the most virtuous, etc. princess because she corresponds to this ring. and the prince has to search the whole kingdom to find who the ring belongs to or who the ring fits. And yeah, so it's a symbol that corresponds to an anticipated reality. It's not that the prince first, sees the ring and the princess together and then sort of associates them together. It's the prince sees the ring and sort of anticipates what the reality of the princess that accompanies the ring or that the ring points towards, anticipates that reality, and that anticipation amplifies the value of the reality that it points towards. And so all these images of transformation likewise have this sort of anti-perceptual nature, in the sense that these stories of saints bringing children back to life are not based on an actual observation of this event happening, but of a sort of anticipation of the capacity for transformation that the saint has. The saint has the power of influencing others to transform their lives and so on. Yeah, so that's why these are sort of anticipatory images or anti-perceptual images.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wonder if the perceptual symbols psychoanalysis studied would be more like past oriented than the expectation oriented symbols that Simondon is talking about here.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what he has in mind when he talks about psychoanalytic symbols as being perceptual. But yeah, so potentially he's thinking of the way that, so like in analysis of dreams, for example, you look at like one of the sort of techniques that Freud uses is to look at the events of the day preceding the dream as what sort of gets incorporated into the dream. And Freud has this sort of doctrine that it's always the events of the day of the dream that end up getting incorporated into the dream. So you experience some, I don't know, you have an argument with a friend or your partner or whatever, and some elements of that argument get incorporated into your dream, and of course transformed and used as symbols of other sort of unconscious desires and elements of your infantile life and so on. But yeah, so these symbols always they always are drawn from our contemporary environment. They're always the events of the last day. And yeah, so I think maybe that's what Simondon has in mind here when he talks about psychoanalytic symbols as being perceptual symbols. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. I can read this, about a page or so. Okay. When becoming is not conceived as amplificatory, either through the intervention of grace as a supernatural amplificatory power, or through the movement of life and creative evolution, the image of the future as individual or collective destiny encounters limits and undergoes a relative closure. The image may be judged and found to be predeterminable, like lives choosing their souls in the Platonic myth, at the moment when the messenger announces that, quote, the god declines any responsibility, unquote. Then it is only in relation to the desires and pains felt in the course of previous lives that most of the souls reincarnate in the body of a wrestler, a tyrant, or a peacock. These images of the future, precisely because the god declines responsibility, contain no creative element. They are merely the countertype of situations actually experienced or perceived. The very image of the ideal city is fully determined and limited in a cyclical conception of time that starts again at the end of the great year. The recourse to the marvelous or supernatural is not the only path allowing the imaginary anticipation of the future to exercise its amplificatory power as a factor of reality within projected time. Within individual humans, there are also productive forces which, more modestly, may construct an exclusive world in which the motor schema exerts itself and becomes concretized. It is the work of the amateur, that is, those who act out of love for what they do. The initial postulate of amateurism is a relative dichotomy that separates the theater and object of constructive passion from the time and place of collective obligation. At times, nevertheless, the lineaments of the imaginary world arise in the moments of lesser tension of obligatory collective activity. Ferdinand Cheval, who built for many years his ideal palace in Haute-Rive, would find on his rounds the stones with singular features that he organized into fantastical assemblages. If they were light enough, he would pick the stones on the spot. The heavier ones were collected later with a wheelbarrow. Working alone for years, this man gave shape, as he tells it, to a dream he had had. Among the shapes he created, several, such as the great statues, belonged to the category of the, quote, reproductive imagination, unquote, inspired by the Cambodian temples Cheval had seen during his military service. but others, especially the non-figurative assemblages of stones, truly express this amplificatory and proliferating power of the gesture of construction that is diversified by going forward, directed only by the primordial intuition of a line or a motor theme. The surrealists accorded great importance to the manifestation of human imagination exercised outside of the path of imitation. The film Ingres's Violin represents Cheval's ideal palace together with other similar productions by other amateurs. The development of DIY in contemporary industrial societies does not correspond only to certain socioeconomic necessities, disappearance of household staff, high cost of repair and upkeep of main appliances, or the use of complex devices in a decentralized habitat. The imperative to DIY also emerges from the organization of a permanent operative availability of tools and materials in a regime of leisure and freedom for the individual. It is the return of honorable and disinterested artisanship in the framework of leisure granted by the occupations of industrial society. The home workshop restitutes the local and independent dimension of production that belonged to the domainio manorial economy. Thanks to it, the worker, the salaried professional, the shop or public employee has immediate access to the tools of production and may become the boss of the whole project, from the first sketch belonging to the intuition of the image to the concrete completion of the project. The imagination as anticipation is thus no longer a function severed from reality and deployed in unreality and in fiction. It triggers an effective activity of realization because the subject who projects the image is the owner of the tools of production and the workable materials needed. The modality of the imaginary is that of potentiality. It only becomes the modality of unreality if the individual is deprived of access to the conditions of realization. Through a close analysis of the characteristics of the appliances required for DIY, we re-encounter the preoccupation with the availability of the fabricating operation in relation to the imaging intention, sometimes taken to a non-functional excess. The machines made for amateurs present themselves willfully and systematically as entirely convertible or adaptable to all tasks, all materials, all sources of electrical power. In actuality, this flexibility is often more apparent than real, and the impression of freedom may be only apparent too, or compensated by a loss of time when, from one task to another, one must change the assembly or combination of tools. Such appliances appear to have been conceived so as to tailor themselves to the feeling of unlimited freedom for virtual uses, thus in the logic of the project in a pure perspective of the future, rather than with the concern for functional use. These all-purpose machines abstractly guarantee a full freedom according to long-term anticipation, but they then require the non-simultaneity of the various operations of use, detrimental to the short-term anticipation and adaptation to the present, characterizing the intraperceptual organization of tasks for execution. The rhetoric of virtuality is the index of imaginary anticipation, characterizing the activity of DIY, partially born as a mode of compensation of the constraining regularity, the lack of autonomy, and the fragmented aspect of the tasks of everyday life. Work in pieces, in Friedman's expression. We may note the importance of the development of this kind of activity in a society like the United States, at the high economic level, with an important participation by upper classes with no direct connection with the, quote, dark world of working classes, a vestigial form of the factotum, in which there is an independence of conception and execution, since the factotum must at all times answer according to the randomness of emergencies, unpredictable demands unforeseen by the project. To summarize, we can say that the image as motor anticipation is deployed according to different cultural contexts by bringing about an amplificatory metamorphosis of the object, either through identification with an imaginary world where others act in lieu of the subject, in a landscape where the splendor of the real is multiplied, or through a true action on a raw material in the situation of leisure. But in all cases, the effect of anticipation as a priori image is an amplificatory proliferation from a single origin located in the subject. This proliferation multiplies paths and forms in the future. It is the analog of a growth, a maturation, or a development, comprising both differentiation and supplemental being, supplément d'être. It enacts towards the future the amplificatory projection of the potentialities of the subject's present. So Angus has posted in the chat here some links to Ferdinand Cheval and his ideal palace, which is pretty remarkable. These sort of fantastical constructions that he made apparently just by picking up rocks and stones as he was, delivering the mail. He sort of, some of them, like the one that Angus posted in the chat here, has a sort of vague resemblance to Cambodian temples. So there's a kind of memory image aspects to them that they're sort of reproductions of something that he did perceive because he was in Cambodia on his military service. But others are sort of just abstract forms that he imagined and sort of realized just by putting together these stones. And this general sort of idea of the amateur and DIY culture, this idea of this sort of capacity to produce anything that you imagine. This is a sort of general phenomenon or general aspect of DIY culture, where there's this idea that part of the appeal of this I don't know, cultural activity is to have this capacity that you control the whole process. Whereas a carpenter, like a professional carpenter, for example, they have a client who requests a certain type of object, and they have to work according to a certain pattern and produce an object that fits the requirements of the client. Whereas in your home workshop, you can imagine whatever type of object you want, and buy the wood, and you have all the tools you need, and you sort of produce the object in accordance with your imagination. And so you have no obligation to anyone else, and you have this capacity to bring about this sort of image. So your product sort of realizes the image that you had only in your mind at the outset of the process. And Simondon points out that a lot of the sort of tools and materials and other elements that are sold to DIY enthusiasts have this sort of multi-valent or polymorphic character, in that they're designed, or they're sold, marketed as being capable of any type of operation. So it's not just a sort of, like the tools that a professional carpenter uses might be specialized for a particular kind of operation, but the tools that are sold to the amateur who has a workshop in their own home, those tools will be designed or marketed as being capable of working on any type of wood, and operating at any angle, and all sorts of variations and different possibilities are open to this kind of tool. So again, it's this kind of virtuality that is inherent in these images that the DIY enthusiast brings about in their operation on whatever sort of materials they work with.
Do you think this line about this kind of strange line where he says there's no direct connection with the quote unquote dark work of the working classes, is he saying that he thinks that in the US there's more direct participation in the process of the sort of the work beyond the level of conception and at the level of execution than in France? Otherwise, I'm not sure what he's saying there.
Yeah, I think the idea is that this sort of DIY culture is maybe more prevalent in the U.S. than in France, or at least in the 1950s and 60s when he's writing about. And he actually did visit the U.S. Around this time. I don't know exactly what year it was, but his idea, and whether this is accurate or not, his idea is that this was something that's more prevalent in the U.S. And one sort of explanation you might think of would be that there's a sort of economic necessity of DIY, of repairing your own appliances and so on. But this contradicts the fact that the U.S., especially at this time, was a much richer country than France. So if this sort of repair and DIY work was sort of born of economic necessity, you would expect that France would have more of it than the U.S. did at that time. But and Simondon points out that even in the sort of upper classes, or those who have no sort of direct connection with working class life, they also participate. So you find if you sort of visit a wealthy suburb, you'll find lots of people that have a workshop in their garage where they repair their cars, or they have woodworking tools or whatever. And again, these are not sort of out of economic necessity. It's not that they can't afford to take the car to a mechanic and have someone else work on it. It's that working on the car yourself is part of how you sort of make the car into this virtuality that you can sort of modify and work on and transform however you desire. And so I think, yeah, this bit about the dark work of the working classes is sort of to contrast this kind of DIY culture with what might be what might seem similar in the sort of repair work that you do out of economic necessity. So this is a different kind of work process where you are engaging in transformation of materials or objects, not because you have to do it, but because you have this sort of image of the object as something infinitely transformable.
Yeah, think about like a Swiss Army knife, but it's like stuffed with like 60 extra parts that you don't need, so it's just like this like all-in-one, all-purpose sort of.
Yeah, and a Swiss Army knife is a great example because, I guess the idea of a Swiss Army knife, or like the sort of utilitarian version of a Swiss Army knife, would be something that you take when you're camping or, and doing some sort of outdoors activity where you have you don't want to carry 10 different tools. You have one tool that does all the different things. But of course, like probably 99% of the time when like we don't actually use these kinds of tools in like a camping setting where it does make sense to sort of pack as many tools as possible into one compact package. Yeah, it's this sort of capacity to do anything with the tool that we sort of valorize in the tool, and the tool is marketed as being able to do anything, but most of the time we won't use like anywhere near the set of capacities that it actually has.
I think in a way, in the current DIY scene, the paradigmatic tool is the 3D printer, which has an interesting relationship to this.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, so a 3D printer, like part of the whole sort of ethos of 3D printing is that you can print anything. Like you just imagine it, you draw up the designs on your computer, and you print it. This is sort of like what makes it such a fascinating object for some people, is that you can just produce anything. You don't have to sort of find the right parts and the right components that you have to put together. It's all sort of just from your imagination into reality. And so, yeah, this versatility of the 3D printer and this capacity to produce anything you can imagine is a great example of this kind of DIY culture.
And but also in relation to the economic situation of DIY, right? If you look at DIY bases right now, like on the internet, or even like if you go to a makerspace, right? Like a lot of the discussions around DIY start more and more just presuming that you have access to a 3D printer, and there's some other stuff where this works, but that's not really an option if you're like looking for a solution to a specific problem where you can't afford to go like the mass manufactured way, if you want.
Yeah, and yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so buying, like if you're just sort of doing DIY out of economic necessity, buying a 3D printer and printing a part for your, I don't know, fridge or whatever, is probably not an economical route. It's not going to make sense for you to actually just buy a 3D printer and design the part for yourself. There's so in general, the sort of economic necessity argument is probably going to lead you to instead just buy components, like stock components off of eBay or something, and fix your appliance or whatever it is, using these parts that have already been produced. It's the decision to print the part for yourself or print the object for yourself is not based on in general, or most of the time, is not based on a sort of economic necessity that this is the cheapest way of repairing my object. It's often based on this this sort of imaginary virtuality of the 3D printer, that you can produce anything with it. So yeah, I think the 3D printer is something that I think Simondon would have had a lot of interest in as a sort of manufacturer of images. And just a sort of biographical note, Simondon, I don't know like a lot about this aspect, but he did sort of do DIY stuff himself, repairing electronics, for example. And he would, when he was teaching, he would set up like demos of various electronic apparatus for his students and things like that. So he's speaking, partly from experience here. He participated in this culture as well. So he's not sort of criticizing it and saying this is like bad or something like that. He's just sort of pointing out this one aspect of the way that this culture valorizes this sort of openness of the technical objects to use in any capacity of working on any sort of material and so on. So yeah, it's something that he's speaking from experience when he's describing this. And so we'll pick up on section C. So the next bit will be the third level. So the anticipatory image at the level of reflexive thought. So yeah, we'll see what exactly that means next time. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming out. And as a reminder, so we'll meet again next week, but the week after that, I'll be away. So we'll take a break for 2 weeks and then come back so we have a session next week on the 9th, and then 2 weeks break on the 16th and 23rd. And then we should be able to come back on the 30th, assuming everything works out with my travel arrangements. So yeah, just a reminder for everyone. Right. So thanks everyone for coming out, and see you next week.